Hello, I am Samuel, an interpreter in our recreated James Fort. By 1619, colonist John Rolfe had established himself as a prominent figure in the Virginia Company's colony. His marriage to Pocahontas in 1614 confirmed a temporary peace between the English colonists and the Powhatan people. Rolfe had also held important positions as secretary of the colony and as member of the governor's council, and his early experiments with tobacco had transformed the crop into a highly profitable cash crop. But large amounts of land and labor would be required to make the colony successful. During the winter of 1619-1620, Rolfe penned a long and detailed letter to the newly appointed treasurer of the Virginia Company of London, Sir Edwin Sandys, to update him on recent developments in the colony. It is important to note that several factions had developed in the Virginia Company at this time, and Sand's 1619 ascent to the office of treasurer had been supported by the Warwick faction, a group led by Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, and his cousin Nathaniel Rich. This faction wanted to make Virginia a haven for privateering and piracy against Spanish shipping. Rolfe's letter aimed to provide information while also strengthening his relationship with Sands, a key benefactor. In his correspondence, Rolfe highlighted the key outcomes of the first General Assembly meeting, offered a defense of the deposed Governor Samuel Argall, and provided updates on various trial rulings. Amid these updates, Rolfe briefly and casually mentioned that in late August of 1619, a ship called White Lion approached Point Comfort, carrying not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. He also noted that several days later, another ship, Treasurer, which both deposed Governor Samuel Argall's family and the Rich family of the Warwick faction had financial interest in, arrived carrying additional Africans. John Wood, the treasurer's navigator, stated under oath that 2 or 3 Negroes they cast at Virginia before quickly departing for and taking 25 Africans to Bermuda. The White Lion and treasurer, with suspect right to privateer, had been operating in the Caribbean when they intercepted a Portuguese ship, taking enslaved Africans from Luanda to Mexico. For White Lion and treasurer, Virginia was a safe port. Rolfe's written account is among the earliest documented evidence of the presence of Africans in the colony of Virginia. Today, we will be exploring what was happening in Virginia at this time and how this fits into the bigger picture. Now today I am joined by Harvey Bakari. He is our curator of Black History and Culture, and he joined the foundation in 2023. But thank you very much for joining me on this rainy day.
You're welcome, Sam.
Because this is an important piece of documentation that we need to get into, and it is wonderful to have you talk about this.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I have a handful of questions for you, but my first and foremost one is with John Rolfe's letter. It lacks a lot of important details. For example, he simply refers to these as 20 and odd Africans. Could you give us some more information that might be lacking in his writing that are found in other pieces of evidence?
Well, I think over time, historians have looked at other sources in archives in Britain as well as in Spain, and they were able to piece together the events that occurred here in 1619 in August and early September. Prior to that, there had been quite a bit of secrecy or kind of shady business, if you will, to cover up the activities in the colonies, because the captain of one of the privateer ships, he could have been charged for violating the treaty with Spain. He could have been charged with piracy, and he could have been hanged.
Okay.
So historically, there has been this concealment, if you will, of the circumstances surrounding the earliest arrival of Africans here in Virginia in 1619.
Okay. So you had mentioned sort of like their circumstances had been, sort of covered up a bit. Could you elaborate on what were their circumstances from where they're from, and also what were the circumstances that led them to being brought over here?
Yes, it's kind of a global picture that I have to paint for you. So first, we have to start on the continent of Africa with the Portuguese and the Kingdom of Congo, the Kingdom of Ndongo, and their diplomatic relationships, their trade with various goods, including enslaved people. And it's believed, as historians have been looking at this question, that some of the earliest victims of warfare and subsequently enslaved were from an urban area of the Ndongo people.
Okay.
And as this trade was taking place on the coast of Africa with the Portuguese, some of the earliest African captives that would eventually come to British North America. Now, we have to make sure we make that distinction, because sometimes people say America, but Africans have been in the Americas enslaved since the 1500s with Spanish and Portuguese colonies. So we have to be specific when we're talking about the first Africans to British North America or the first to Virginia.
Okay.
So once they were captured, they were on a mission to take them to a Spanish colony. Only the Portuguese could transport Africans to the Americas. The Spanish were forbidden by the Vatican to do so. Second, the Portuguese had to baptize. They could not take quote-unquote pagans, non-Christians across the Atlantic. So they had to be baptized and given Christian names. So that's why you will see in the records names like Angelo, Anthony, and so forth. So there, as the ship is on its way to Veracruz, Mexico, they have a high mortality rate. For many of these African captives, they've been through a series of trauma, being captured, being detained, being forcefully baptized. Many of them are captured from the interior. They may not have seen the ocean. So you're going through a series of trauma, including the fact that on that particular voyage, over 100 people had perished and had died on that voyage. So the ship stopped, the Portuguese slave ship stopped in Jamaica to offload and get some refreshments. And then as they were on their way to Veracruz, Mexico, there were two privateers, English privateers, the White Lion and the Treasurer, that were waiting to seize the ship. Because at that time, you have the slave trade, but you also have privateers and pirates who would attack the ships and take their human cargo. But perhaps because the White Lion and the Treasurer were not quote-unquote slave ships in the classical sense, they may not have been prepared for the people that they seized off the Portuguese ship to be able to, one, have the type of instruments to contain them or chains to contain them. People have to be, the enslaved Africans will have to be fed twice a day, many times from food that they're familiar with from their regions. And so perhaps the White Lion and Treasurer, as they seize those Africans, who again are going through another series of trauma. Imagine you've already been on a slave ship for perhaps a number of weeks. You're listening to people speak Portuguese. All of a sudden, the ship is being stopped. People are coming on speaking English. And you're like, what's going on? And then some people have been taken off. They didn't take all of the African captives. Some remain. So you can imagine for those African captives, it's this constant unknown. What's going to happen next? Am I going to survive? Who dies next? We're listening to Portuguese. Now we're listening to English. Where are they taking us? Why? So all of these type of traumatic questions and experiences are occurring amongst the captives when the White Lion and the Treasurer captures them and proceeds to take them through the Atlantic, the Gulf Coast.
So we have these two ships you mentioned, the White Lion and the Treasurer, and their status as privateers or pirates is questionable. Could you elaborate on that?
It's easy to imagine when we think of 1619 that these huge slave ships are coming to Jamestown and disembarking these African people from Central Africa. But a privateer is not a slave ship. A slave ship is specifically crafted and built to carry human cargo, to feed them at least twice a day, as I mentioned earlier before. So there's a whole process that's involved in having an infrastructure for a ship to carry African captives. Now, you do have what was referred to as interlopers, which could be a privateer or a pirate ship, ships that would sail between the coastlines of, let's say, the Caribbean and Virginia or other colonies. So it's just important for people to understand that in the classical sense of a slave ship, that's not what occurred here in 1619. This was a privateer. They robbed a slave ship, the Portuguese slave ship, on the way to Mexico. But there's a difference in that particular framework. So the British eventually become involved in the classical sense of creating, building, and trafficking with slave ships with the intent of bringing Africans to Virginia, but that happens a little bit later or mid-century of the 1600s.
Rolfe had mentioned how these African captives were sold to the governor and the Cape merchant, but he didn't really elaborate on what their status in the colony was. Would you be able to elaborate on what the status in the colony could have been?
Yes, most historians debate about whether they were free or enslaved, but most agree that they were unfree. And one of the reasons why there's disagreement is because you have some exceptional cases. You have Mary and Anthony Johnson, who arrived in like 1621 and 1622, who went on to become free. They married, they had a family, they had land and property. So you can find examples of people like that. But then, just because there's no law doesn't mean that people are not being kept to serve for life. So we do have documentations of someone in their last will and testament would say, I bequeath to you servant Isabella and all of her future issue, which would be all of her future children. So by default, that is generational hereditary slavery. So by the 1660s, as more Africans are being imported, you start to see more codification. People want clarification. And so that's when they start to codify in 1662, the condition of the mothers, the condition of the child, making slavery hereditary. But Virginia slow walks into slavery. It's not a quick 1619 and suddenly there's slavery, because when the first Africans forcefully arrive in Virginia, they are part of what historians refer to as the unfree workforce. European indentured servants, indigenous people as servants or slaves, and then you now introduce Africans. So they're not the only workforce at the beginning. So as you move through the 1600s, there's a series of events that lead to codification, and by the time you get to the end of the 1600s, you have more increase of more diverse Africans, not just West Central Africans. Matter of fact, they become the minority group. The majority comes from the Bight of Biafra, which would today be Nigeria, Senegambia, which would today be like Senegal, and they're also bringing their culture and their influence on Virginia in large numbers. And the other events that happening by the end of the 1600s is there's less indentured servants coming from Europe. So now the plantation complex is turning more towards African labor. And so by the time you end the 1600s, you're going into the 1700s, and Virginia is really becoming a slave-owning society. So let me put it this way. By the end of the 1600, 1699 or so, 1700, maybe about 7% of the population is of African descent and enslaved. By the time you get to the American Revolution, 1775, over 40% of the population is enslaved. So this transition doesn't happen instantly, even though sometimes we compress history and we say, hey, this happened here and then that happened. It was a gradual process that has at least 2 to 3 stages of moving from the first arrivals from Central West Africa to getting to a more diverse population where the Central West Africans are the minority, as I said, the Nigerians and those from Senegal who may have more Islamic heritage are shaping Virginia as we start moving into the 1700s and the American Revolution.
So for the early Africans, how might their lives have been different from here in Virginia compared to their home back in Africa?
Well, it's going to be dramatically different in the sense that something as simple as their worldview, their culture, they're no longer as captive the center of their world. They now have to adjust to a European worldview as captives in Virginia. So they come empty-handed, but not empty-headed, which means they're still bringing their culture with them. Sometimes they're bringing their technologies. You can look at even some of the architecture. There have been historians who've studied what are the influence that Africans are bringing to the Americas, because many times we look at, okay, the Africans were captured and they were brought to the Americas and they had to have European clothing and so forth. But there are other historians who look at how did the Africans make their cultural impression on the colonists here in Virginia. So first, the presence of Africans in their increasing numbers causes by the 1691 for the English to start to identify themselves as white. So in the legal terms, this is the first time they have to use the term white. Why would they have to use the term white previous to that? Like say, hey, it was not a useful term. But now being in the context of Africans and indigenous people, they create an umbrella and use the term white, and many times synonymous with, since we're in the church, Christians, white Christians. So it is also the African presence is affecting how Europeans see themselves. Other historians look at the cultural influences, the convergence of religion and cultural practice. Others look at foodways. How are the Africans impacting the foodways that the colonists are eating in the colonies? Others Africans who come from a tropical region who create houses that are referred to today as shotgun houses or shogun from Nigeria. As I said, as you get to the end of the 1600s, most are coming from Nigeria, that many historians believe that they are influencing the architecture as well. So the Africans in this convergence of cultures, they're not just people who are being imposed by European practices and norms, but they're also influencing European practices and norms in different ways as well. So that's part of the story of convergence of cultures, because someone who is born in England versus someone who's white and born in Virginia are two different people. And so eventually the people who are Creole or Virginia born, whether they're of African descent or European descent, are going to have a different viewpoint from their relatives, whether on the continent of Africa or in Europe. So this convergence of culture becomes part of the shaping of the colonies and how it moves forward as you move into the era of the American Revolution. So
pulling it all together, what is the historical significance of the arrival of the first Africans and John Rolfe's writing and just all the documentation and laws that we have all together?
Well, the historical importance of it all, the why, is that I think for educators, for students, it's important to know not just the history, but also to know that what is referred to as the historiography, which means that the history of history is that for a long period of time, this type of history is not important in school curriculums, in colleges and universities. But to really understand the American story, we have to know all of the cultures that were involved in the American story. And so just as something as simple as Europeans identifying themselves as white gives us a sense of, here's a terminology we're still using today that was originated here at least legally in the 1600s here at Jamestown. Sometimes even how people refer to themselves today, students referred to themselves as white or black or even biracial, that issue was addressed here in Jamestown as well, the idea of a mulatto. And even today, we still tend to practice, if there's an interracial relationship between African American and a white American, the child may often be associated as African American or black, depending on how they look. There's no law, there's no rule, but it's something that was practiced here at Jamestown in the 1600s that still impacts how people see themselves today, how people classify themselves today, and how people interact according to their parentage. So a lot of these issues were addressed at the General Assembly here at Jamestown in the 1600s, and they still impact us. But the importance is to help students, to help teachers, to help the general public understand a fuller picture of what life was like. Because today in the 21st century, we can choose, we have the convenience of forgetting any part of history that we may find uncomfortable or not relevant. But at the time period in the 1600s, the people who lived here, the people of European, African, and indigenous descent, could not afford to ignore the world in which they lived. And so in many cases, the history is trying to create a holistic experience so that as we look into the past not with just one lens, but we look into the past with multiple lenses so that people can see themselves. It can help them answer questions that they have today about their status or their race and how the country was formed. And it'll give people a better picture even of what our founding fathers, because they inherited this. They talk about this. The 1600s, slavery, Jefferson talks about it, that they were born into a system of slavery. And the revolution gave them an opportunity to try to begin to address that and address some of the contradictions, which is more than we have enough time to talk about right now. But nevertheless, I think it's just important for those different lenses for people, particularly students, to have the opportunity that my generation didn't have in school and many generations didn't have in school to learn about the true texture of this American experience.
All right, well, thank you very much, Harvey, for joining me and talking about this. And thank you for watching. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you would like to learn more, feel free to come visit us here at Jamestown Settlement and our sister museum at American Revolutionary Museum at Yorktown.